Tonight, I think Democrats are expecting some engagement here, and I expect we'll get it.
Night 2 of the second Democratic debate featured Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Andrew Yang, Julian Castro, Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, Jay Inslee, Michael Bennett, and Bill de Blasio. While numerous smaller candidates bombarded Joe Biden, as I and many others predicted, the evening was not without its fair share of surprises. For example, the prosecutor getting prosecuted.
She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place.
And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches.
Not to say that it was a surprise that Tulsi took on Kamala, but the fact that this seemed to catch the senator off guard was pretty unexpected. In this video, I'm going to break down the most dramatic moments, sure to affect the primary contest, and answer the questions who won and who took the L. We have to start with Tulsi Gabbard. For the second debate in a row, Tulsi managed to make herself the most Googled candidate on stage. No doubt because both nights the relatively little-known progressive candidate made minced meat out of another candidate. In the first debate, she shot down Tim Ryan over who flew planes into buildings. This time she went after a far more dangerous target, but had no shortage of ammunition.
Senator Harris says she's proud of her record. She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place.
Here was Kamala's response.
I did the work of significantly reforming the criminal justice system of a state of 40 million people. And I am proud of that work. And I am proud of making a decision to not just give fancy speeches or be in a legislative body and give speeches on the floor, but actually doing the work.
Really? Fancy speeches? That's all she's got?
In the case of those who were on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology.
Surely this time, Kamala will have a better response.
I think you can judge people by when they are under fire, and it's not about some fancy opinion on a stage.
Big improvement there. Now it's fancy opinions. As everyone knows, some Americans are deeply concerned with issues in the criminal justice system, but not nearly as much as they are concerned about the scourge of fancy opinions. Obviously, this exchange was a serious L for Kamala Harris, and a big win for Tulsi Gabbard. This alone would have been enough to mark Tulsi a victor in this debate. But unlike her first debate performance, where her energy level seemed generally low, this time around Tulsi was on point, focused, and effective the whole night through. While Tulsi is mainly known for her opposition to regime change wars, she also demonstrated a strong knowledge of trade with her progressive critique of TPP.
I think the central one was the fact that it gave away our sovereignty to a panel of international corporations whose rulings would supersede any domestic law that we would pass, either a federal law or a state or a local law. This is extremely dangerous and goes against the very values that we have as a country.
This isn't to say that Tulsi presented a purely progressive message. I've noticed that some of her supporters seem to characterize her as even more progressive than Bernie Sanders. That's actually not true in most arenas, and Tulsi made this quite clear in her answer to a question about free college.
One of the authors of that plan, Senator Sanders, believes college should be tuition-free for undocumented immigrants as well. Do you?
I don't.
Where Tulsi is at least as progressive as anyone else in the race, at least now that Mike Gravel has dropped out, is her opposition to regime change wars. In this area, she delivered a sharp response to Cory Booker.
And so I will bring our troops home, and I will bring them home as quickly as possible. But I will not set during a campaign an artificial deadline.
This is not about arbitrary deadlines. This is about leadership. The leadership I will bring to do the right thing, to bring our troops home within the first year in office.
While everyone seemed to notice Tulsi's demolishment of Kamala's record as AG of California, what's gotten a lot less attention is her attack on Kamala's healthcare plan.
The reality is right now we don't have a healthcare system. We have a sick care system.
By the way, I'm pretty sure she borrowed that line from Marianne Williamson in the first debate.
And there are far too many people in this country who are sick and unable to get the care that they need because they cannot afford it. Now, Kamala Harris just talked about Kathleen Sebelius, who helped write her bill. This just pointed to the fatal flaw in her proposal. Sebelius works for Medicare Advantage, private insurance company who will stand to profit under her plan.
Representative Gabbard got it wrong. Kathleen Sebelius did not write my plan. She endorsed it.
That's a distinction without a difference, of course. Tulsi's point is that Kamala is bragging that an insurance company, toady, likes the plan. That's right, I said toady. If you view healthcare from the progressive perspective, that the central problem with healthcare in America today is that people are profiteering from illness, then it doesn't matter whether one of those profiteers wrote or merely endorsed a plan. The point is that if someone benefits from the corruption of a system, they are not likely to approve of anything that would genuinely remove corruption from that system. Now, you might want to say that Kamala doesn't want to villainize the private healthcare system, so this is all irrelevant. But Kamala herself took up the progressive argument against the private industry in her attacks against Joe Biden's healthcare plan.
Pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies last year alone profited $72 billion. And that is on the backs of American families.
After failing to respond substantively to Tulsi's critique, Kamala pivoted to do what would become a pattern throughout much of the night: attack Joe Biden.
As being one of the plans that is the best to get us to a place where everyone is going to have access to health care in America. And when we talk about this again, I'm going to go back to Vice President Biden.
Despite my many issues with Kamala Harris, I have believed this whole primary season so far that she is one of the most talented politicians in the Democratic field. She's usually incredibly well-spoken, strong, sharp, and capable of evoking emotion. But this debate was certainly not her night. She basically summed it all up in her opening statement.
Who are we? And I think most of us know that part of the answer to that question is we are better than this.
I've already shown you some of the damage Kamala was dealt by Tulsi Gabbard, but she also took serious damage from Joe Biden, who criticized her along similar lines. The two had major exchanges over areas of race and criminal justice, as well as over healthcare.
The senators had several plans so far.
That's true. Kamala has on multiple occasions supported Medicare for all, then walked it back. Prior to the release of her new plan, it was tricky to pin down where exactly she stood on the healthcare issue.
And anytime someone tells you you're going to get something good in 10 years, you should wonder why it takes 10 years.
Another devastating point by Biden here: if Kamala got her plan passed on day one of her administration and she were re-elected to a second term, she would still be out of office for 2 years before the plan was fully enacted. I think it's reasonable to doubt the intentions of someone who wants to enact a plan in such a way that they cannot possibly have to face political consequences of its implementation. Moreover, we ought to doubt the practicality of implementing such a plan, since the GOP would have a full decade to block, defund, amend, and destroy the plan before it is fully implemented.
You can't beat President Trump with double talk on this plan.
We will ensure that everyone has access to health care. Your plan, by contrast, leaves out almost 10 million Americans.
But I'll say this for Kamala Harris: she consistently punched back. Joe's attacks on Kamala were certainly not one-sided.
Where you made a decision for years to withhold resources to poor women to have access to reproductive health care, do you now say that you have evolved and you regret that? Because you've only, since you've been running for president this time, said that you in some way would take that back, or you didn't agree with the decision that you made over many, many years.
In numerous exchanges, the candidates dealt damage to one another. But here's the thing: they were both much more effective at tearing down the other than they were at defending their own positions and records. As a result, in my view, they each did more damage to the other than they helped themselves. And these relative draws were losses for both candidates. A clear example of this was when Kamala Harris was called on to respond to Biden's insistence that his 1970s view on busing was the same as her current view on busing now. Harris pointed out the damage Biden's segregationalist allies might have done to America.
Had those segregationists their way, I would not be a member of the United States Senate, Cory Booker would not be a member of the United States Senate, and Barack Obama would not have been in a position to nominate him to the title he now holds.
Rather than effectively respond to Harris's critique, he went after her record as Attorney General of California and landed damage.
When Senator Harris was the Attorney General for 8 years, there were 2 of the most segregated school districts in the country. I didn't see a single solitary time she brought a case against them to desegregate them. She had a police department when she was there, was abusing people's rights. She, in fact, was told by her own people that she should do something about and disclose to defense attorneys like me. She didn't do that. She never did it. Along came a federal judge and said, enough, enough, and he freed 1,000 of these people.
Once again, while Kamala continued to insist that she's proud of the work she's accomplished, she pivoted to an aggressive attack on Biden's record on criminal justice.
I am proud of the work we did, work that has received national recognition, cleaning up the consequences of the bills that you passed when you were in the United States Senate for decades.
So this debate looked like a loss for Kamala Harris, but that doesn't mean it was a win for her frequent sparring partner, Joe Biden, either. Biden took plenty of damage from Kamala Harris, but she was by no means the only candidate who went after him.
Everybody's talking about how terrible I am on these issues.
Both Bill de Blasio and Kirsten Gillibrand were effective in knocking Biden and Kamala at the same time on issues surrounding healthcare.
I don't know what the vice president and senator are talking about. The folks I talk to about health insurance say that their health insurance isn't working for them. There's tens of millions of Americans who don't even have health insurance, tens of millions more who have health insurance they can barely make work because of the copays, the deductibles, the premiums, the out-of-pocket expenses. There's this mythology that somehow all these folks are in love with their insurance in America. What I hear from union members and from hardworking middle-class people is they wish they had better insurance.
Insurance companies, for these plans that rely on insurance companies, I'm sorry, they're for-profit companies. They have an obligation to their shareholders. They pay their CEO millions of dollars. They have to have quarterly profits. They have fat in the system that's real, and it should be going to healthcare.
Now, there were actually a ton of effective attacks against Joe Biden delivered by smaller candidates, which I will point out in a moment, but first let's just talk about all the ways Biden dunked on himself. First, sticking with healthcare in defending his plan, Biden pointed out that it would not cost as much in taxes as the more progressive plans. He got applause for talking about this, but if this argument for small government wasn't enough to make him sound like a Republican, he also gratuitously attacked New York and California.
My plan cost $750 billion. That's what it cost, not $30 trillion.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
So this idea is a bunch of malarkey, what we're talking about here. The fact of the matter is that there will be a deductible. It will be a deductible in their paycheck. Bernie acknowledges it. And I don't know what math you do in New York. I don't know what math you do in California, but I tell you, that's a lot of money. And there will be a deductible. The deductible will be out of your paycheck because that's what we require.
He seemed to get a lot of approving laughter from the audience for that, I guess because he's mocking Kamala and de Blasio, but honestly, he sounds like Ted Cruz in that moment. I personally think that if you want to be president of the United States, you shouldn't mock any state in the union. Except, of course, Florida. I'm kidding. Now, in my video about the Night 1 debate, I pointed out how there were a ton of questions delivered by moderators that were framed to damage Bernie Sanders. Credit where credit is due, the biggest offender of that, Jake Tapper, actually asked Biden a devastatingly damaging question as well.
What do you say to progressives who worry that your proposals are not ambitious enough to energize the progressive wing of your party, which you will need to beat Donald Trump?
That really is progressive framing of a question. As a progressive myself, it's probably harder for me to spot when a question is framed by a bias that I share, but this is actually a progressive biased question. Because while it is verifiable that grabbing moderate voters in the middle is not as effective a political strategy as mobilizing the base, Tapper's question assumes that progressive policies are inherently better at mobilizing the Democratic voting base. That's an opinion I share, but it's only an opinion. If Biden were able to think effectively on his feet, he would probably point out Tapper's assumption here and contradict it, arguing that the base will be more excited by his public option healthcare plan, his civility, his experience as VP. But Biden did not question the question, nor did he answer it. Recall, Tapper asked Biden what he would say to progressives who argue his plans are not ambitious enough to excite progressives.
Because we did it. I was asked to manage an $87 billion plan to be spent in a total of 18 months that revived this state and many others because it kept us out of a depression.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with what was asked. The bailouts happened in the past, they are not a plan, and they certainly were not progressive. But this was just the beginning of weird things Joe Biden said throughout the debate.
The bills that the future president here, that the senator is talking about.
Yeah, see, that started as a simple gaffe of him accidentally calling Cory Booker the president. It then got much worse as he tried to recover by making a joke, which was kind of condescending, one that coincided with Joe Biden grabbing Booker affectionately, but without consent. Because, of course, Joe Biden is basically a 1970s game show host. Biden also made a terrible argument about his past policies regarding racial issues.
Everybody's talking about how terrible I am on these issues. Barack Obama knew exactly who I was. He had 10 lawyers do a background check on everything about me on civil rights and civil liberties, and he chose me, and he said it was the best decision he made.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I'll take his judgment.
Okay, let's break this down. First, it's an argument from authority. Rather than defending the specific policies he fought for, fighting against busing, supporting draconian crime bills, etc., he simply just states that Obama looked into it and he said it's all good. In the words of Joe Biden, come on, man.
Come on, man. Come on. What happens most? Come on.
Americans aren't that stupid. They can form opinions on their own and don't need Barack Obama to do their thinking for them. Second, Biden's argument relies on the false premise that Obama selected him somehow because of his civil rights record. That's obviously wrong. If Obama really cared about civil rights records, maybe he might have picked a congressperson who was actually a participant in the civil rights movement. Of course, the guy running to be the first black president in American history didn't need to use his VP pick to shore up the black vote. Obama was probably pretty confident that he would be able to shore up that base on his own, even without the help of a white guy who in the past bragged about working with segregationists. No, Obama almost certainly picked Joe to make older white people more comfortable. If he was trying to strengthen his credibility in the black community, he probably wouldn't have chosen as a running mate the guy who, in that very campaign, said of Obama, I mean, you got the first mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man. So, yeah, Obama didn't pick Joe Biden because he was great on racial issues. Quite the opposite. By picking the guy who famously said something well-meaning but totally racist, Obama proved to white folks that they had nothing to fear from the first black president. Of course, one of the most inconsequential but nevertheless memorable flubs for Joe Biden was how he capped off the debate with one of the most awkward moments of television I have ever had the pleasure of witnessing.
If you agree with me, go to Joe 30330 and help me in this fight.
Now, he meant to tell you to text the word Joe to that number, but of course the best way to support Joe Biden is to go to patreon.com/questiontime. The money you will give will not directly go to the Biden campaign, but if you sign up and send me the message Joe3030, I'll be sure to put your dollars towards making very informative videos about Joe Biden. Needless to say, the night was a loss for the vice president, but I do think he had reasonably strong arguments as well. For example, he made a good case for his own version of TPP, still creating a similar deal, but renegotiating it with labor representatives present.
Either China's going to write the rules of the world for the 21st century on trade, or we are. We have to join with the 40% of the world that we had with us, and this time make sure that there's no one sitting at that table doing the deal unless environmentalists are there and labor is there.
And despite having generally more right-wing views on undocumented immigration, Biden was able to effectively articulate a clear difference between himself and Trump, praising the value of immigrants.
The reason we're the country we are is we've been able to cherry pick from the best of every culture. Immigrants built this country. That's why we're so special.
Despite these brighter moments, however, Biden just couldn't contend with the constant hammering he got from smaller candidates. Not least among them was Bill de Blasio, who opened his performance with an attack on Biden.
There are good people on this stage, but there are real differences. Joe Biden told wealthy donors that nothing fundamentally would change if he were president. Kamala Harris said she's not trying to restructure society. Well, I am. For 40 years, working people have taken it on the chin in this country. For 40 years, the rich have gotten richer, and they paid less and less in taxes. It cannot go on this way. When I'm president, we will even up the score, and we will tax the hell out of the wealthy to make this a fairer country and to make sure it's a country that puts working people first.
That was a strong start, and de Blasio, of course, did not relent in his attacks on Biden. After Biden avoided a question regarding Obama's record deportations, de Blasio held his feet to the fire.
I didn't hear your response when the issue came up of all those deportations. You were Vice President of the United States. I didn't hear whether you tried to stop them or not, using your power, your influence in the White House.
The president came along, and he's the guy that came up with the idea, first time ever, of dealing with the Dreamers. He put that in the law. To compare him to Donald Trump, I think, is absolutely bizarre.
Again, Biden avoided the direct challenge, but the next time de Blasio spoke, he pressed Biden once more.
He went right around the question. Mr. Vice President, you want to be President of the United States, you need to be able to answer the tough questions. I guarantee you, if you're debating Donald Trump, he's not going to let you off the hook. So did you say those deportations were a good idea? Or did you go to the president and say, this is a mistake, we shouldn't do it? Which one?
I was vice president. I am not the president. I keep my recommendations to him in private.
Yeah, so another weak answer from Biden there, but not all of de Blasio's attacks landed.
Vice President, I believe you're the only person on the stage who voted for the original NAFTA. Are you ready to say here and now that you will oppose a new NAFTA and that what you will believe in, which a lot of us hope for, is trade treaties that empower organized labor across the boundaries of the world and give working people power again, not just multinational corporations?
Yes.
Your response? Your response, sir?
Yes.
That's it?
No, he said, would I insist that labor be engaged? The answer is yes.
For good measure, de Blasio also attacked Michael Bennett, but on an issue that would obviously hit Biden as well.
Certainly, with all due respect to Senator Bennett, what he's saying is absolutely inaccurate about taxes. Americans right now are paying so much money for their health care. Ask people about the reality of premiums, deductibles, co-pays, out-of-pocket expenses. That's worse than any tax.
But to be honest, as much as I agree with a lot of the ideas that de Blasio was articulating, he kind of made the same mistake as Biden and Harris. He had strong attacks without making a powerful positive case for himself. And he took some damage, I believe, when Julián Castro brought up the case of Eric Gardner, which happened in de Blasio's backyard.
He did that for 7 seconds, 11 different times. Eric Garner said that he couldn't breathe. He knew what he was doing, that he was killing Eric Garner, and yet he has not been brought to justice. That police officer should be off the street.
De Blasio's defense was that the city was blocked from taking any action by the federal government and quickly pivoted to criticizing, you guessed it, Joe Biden.
Mr. Vice President, tell us, what did you do to try and spur on the Justice Department to act in the Garner case?
Thank you, Mayor de Blasio.
We did a lot. Number one, we made sure we reduced the federal prison population by 38,000 people.
Once again, Biden has an irrelevant point here, but that doesn't take anything away from the fact that talking about the Eric Gardner case is inherently harmful to de Blasio's campaign. This topic is to de Blasio's campaign what the South Bend officer-involved shooting case was to Pete Buttigieg's campaign during the first debate. It's essentially an inherently problematic conversation for the candidate, no matter how he handles it. The parallels continued as Gillibrand went full Swalwell on the mayor.
You heard earlier Mayor de Blasio respond to Secretary Castro on the question of why the police officer who killed Eric Gardner is still on the NYPD. Was that response adequate? Please respond.
No, he should be fired. He should be fired now.
This conversation may not have been enough to sink de Blasio, but it's really the only time his own record was addressed by candidates other than himself, and it wasn't pretty. While he was a powerful adversary throughout the debate, I don't think he did a great job of connecting and demonstrating why he should be president. It didn't help that his closing statement sounded like a bad Bernie Sanders impression.
This has to be the party that's not afraid to say out loud, we're going to tax the hell out of the wealthy.
This struck me as sounding insincere and malicious. He also said he wanted to tax the hell out of the wealthy in his opening statement, but at least then he explained why. To help create a fairer system, and in response to a system that has tilted the tables for the wealthy in the past. While he did mention policies like Medicare for All, he wasn't effective at making this connection in his closing statement. And I gotta tell you, as a progressive myself, tax the hell out of the wealthy is not an inspiring message unless you firmly connect it to policies and programs that help the poor and middle class. De Blasio didn't have a terrible performance, but I certainly didn't see anything that would be a game changer for his campaign. And when you're polling as low as he is, that's gotta count as a loss. De Blasio's performance was not all that different from what he did in the first debate, but that too is part of the problem. If you want to stand out, you've got to give us something new every time. Another candidate whose performance was largely a repeat of the last time around was Julián Castro. You might recognize this perfectly good, but familiar argument about immigration law from the last debate.
Open borders is a right-wing talking point. And frankly, I'm disappointed that some folks, including some folks on this stage, have taken the bait. The only way that we're going to guarantee that we don't have family separations in this country again is to repeal Section 1325 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. That is the law that this president, this administration is using to incarcerate migrant parents and then physically separate them from their children.
This got a lot more interesting when he got into a debate with Joe Biden over the issue.
I never heard him talk about any of this when he was the secretary. If you cross the border illegally, you should be able to be sent back. It's a crime. It's a crime.
It looks like one of us has learned the lessons of the past and one of us hasn't. Let me begin by telling you there's still going to be consequences if somebody crosses the border. It's a civil action. What we need are politicians that actually have some guts on this issue.
Thank you, Secretary.
Here, Castro gave Biden the treatment he had given to Beto in the first debate, damaging his opponent while also coming off as strong and knowledgeable. But we already know that Castro is strong on this issue. To truly get a win, Castro will have to sound just as knowledgeable and powerful on other issues as well. Unfortunately, he had some missed opportunities, like his response to this question about Flint.
Secretary Castro, why are you the right candidate to solve this problem? Please respond.
Well, because people don't have to wonder what I would do. I've actually done it. I was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development when Flint had its water crisis. I went to Flint. We did what we could to help folks get water filters, and then we didn't stop there. We improved the standard of how we deal with elevated blood lead levels in children.
That really wasn't a great answer. First, by talking about when Flint had its water crisis, Castro seems to be implying that the crisis is over. It's not. As of April of 2019, there were still roughly 2,500 lead service lines still needing to be replaced, and residents have been told that the water is safe to drink even when this was not the case, so the issue of trust on this matter is likely to linger even after all the lead pipes are gone. Second, while Castro may well have done some good in Flint when he was the HUD secretary, by attaching himself to the water crisis so directly, saying people don't have to wonder and I've done it, he's unnecessarily assuming responsibility for the notoriously ineffective government response to the crisis. Now, this alone was not enough to crash Castro's performance, but there were times when he came off as dry and lacking in energy. For example, this moment where he tacked on to Booker's critique of Biden's record on criminal justice.
I agree with Senator Booker that a lot of what Vice President helped author in '94 was a mistake. And he has flip-flopped on these things.
Overall, Castro really didn't have a poor performance, but in such an action-packed debate, he also didn't do much to draw any special attention. He didn't deliver anything new and exciting, rendering his performance easily forgettable. As a candidate polling on average below 1%, that simply isn't good enough. So while he didn't crash hard, this debate was on balance a loss for Julián. One candidate who did not fail to change up her game from the last debate was Kirsten Gillibrand. Despite having, in my view, a pretty awful performance in the first debate, in this night she improved in several ways. She was no longer a disruptive figure on stage, instead she waited for her turn and used her time wisely. I've already shown some of the attacks she laid against other candidates, but for good measure, let's watch her hold Biden's feet to the fire over the issue of women in the workplace.
When the Senate was debating middle-class affordability for childcare, he voted against it, the only vote. But what he wrote in an op-ed was that he believed that women working outside the home would, quote, create the deterioration of family. He also said that women who were working outside the home were, quote, avoiding responsibility. I just want to know what he meant when he said that.
That was a long time ago, and here's what it was about. It would have given people making today $100,000 a year a tax break for child care. I wanted the child care to go to people making less than $100,000.
What did you mean when you said when a woman works outside the home, it's resulting in, quote, the deterioration of family?
No,
that we are avoiding, these are quotes. It was the title of the op-ed. What did you mean when you said it then?
In the very beginning, my deceased wife worked, but we had children. My present wife has worked all the way through.
But those words are very specific. You said women working outside the home would lead to the deterioration of family. My grandmother worked outside the home. Well, he has
I want to bring Senator Harris
either
into
he
this
no longer
conversation.
believes it. I mean, I just think he needs
I never
to.
believed it.
Thank you,
okay.
Senator Harris.
She really had Biden squirming there, which I think demonstrated her ability to effectively deal damage. But like I say, you also need to present a positive case for yourself.
So when they turn on the television, they look up and their kids say, I want to be like that guy or that woman.
Gillibrand, I think, did this. She presented sharp societal critique with lines like this.
That when their son is walking down a street with a bag of M&Ms in his pocket, wearing a hoodie, his whiteness is what protects him from not being shot.
She had witty lines like this one.
The first thing that I'm going to do when I'm president is I'm going to Clorox the Oval Office.
She also backed the jokes up with serious, positive policy suggestions.
Why not have a green energy race with China? Why not have clean air and clean water for all Americans? Why not rebuild our infrastructure?
I have my doubts that Gillibrand will ever be able to make herself a top contender in this race, but at the same time, I have to admit that I will probably remember that Clorox the White House line for a long time coming. So I've got to give Gillibrand a W for this debate. Another candidate who improved their performance significantly this time around was Andrew Yang. While his first debate performance was tepid, shy, and downright sluggish, even when his microphone was on, this time he came to play with lines that fired up the crowd.
We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes masks.
His closing was equally strong.
You know what the talking heads couldn't stop talking about after the last debate? It was the fact that I wasn't wearing a tie. We're up here with makeup on our faces and our rehearsed attack lines, playing roles in this reality TV show. It's one reason why we elected a reality TV star as our president. We need to be laser focused on solving the real challenges of today.
Throughout the debate, Yang no doubt made the Yang Gang proud, often providing refreshingly original perspectives on issues that matter. On the topic of immigration, he spoke about how the undocumented are being blamed for problems that actually stem from automation.
And if you go to a factory here in Michigan, you will not find wall-to-wall immigrants. You will find wall-to-wall robots and machines. Immigrants are being scapegoated for issues they have nothing to do with in our economy.
He connected Medicare for all to economic growth.
If we say, look, we're going to get healthcare off the backs of businesses and families, then watch American entrepreneurship recover and bloom. That's the argument we should be making to the American people.
He also made the slightly less original point that militarization detracts from domestic investment.
I would bring the troops home, I would de-escalate tensions with Iran, and I would start investing our resources in our own communities.
But to be honest, even though Yang is one of my favorite candidates, I gotta say some of his original perspectives were a little too original.
We should just go back to the writings of Martin Luther King, who in 1967, his book Chaos Our Community, said we need a guaranteed minimum income in the United States of America.
Yeah, it's a good talking point that MLK supported basic income, but that really has nothing to do with healing the racial divide, which is what he was asked about. There were definitely several moments where Yang reverted to a somewhat tenuous argument in favor of his central campaign promise.
What we have to do is we have to give women the economic freedom to be able to improve their own situations and start businesses. And the best way to do this is by putting a dividend of $1,000 a month into their hands.
Look, overall I think Yang did a much better job in this debate. He had sharp lines and strong arguments, but this really may have been a case of too little too late. He certainly proved himself to be an interesting candidate, but in part I think because he failed to engage the others on stage, I don't think he succeeded in seriously connecting to voters who didn't already support him. Because I'm dropping this video more than a week after the debate, I can also confirm that he has actually been declining rather than rising in the polls, as some of the bigger candidates are consolidating the power. I have to say this debate was a narrow loss for Yang, if for no other reason, because he didn't wear a tie. But seriously, this may be my most controversial ruling about this debate, so you guys feel free to express your views on Yang's performance in the comments. For me, I think if he does everything he did this time next time, and also manages to make a couple of moments by attacking bigger candidates and connecting on issues that aren't exactly his foray, he would almost certainly score what I would call a genuine victory. Jay Inslee was yet another weak debater the first time around who showed great improvement in his second performance. He ticked a lot of boxes when it comes to having a strong debate performance when you're a low-polling candidate. Rule number 1 is drive the message home. His message is about climate change, and he certainly pressed the importance of that issue from the very top of the night.
We're at a tipping point, and whether we shrink from this challenge or rise to it is the vital question of our time. We Democrats believe we can still do big things in this nation. We can defeat the climate crisis. Let's get to work.
He also had insightful things to say about issues that are not central to his campaign, but nevertheless important for Democratic voters.
It is time to give people adequate mental health care in this country. And we are.
He demonstrated that he had the chops to attack Trump aggressively.
We can no longer allow a white nationalist to be in the White House, number one. And number two.
And of course, he engaged effectively with the top polling candidate, Joe Biden. He took Biden on when it comes to his green policy, and no surprise, Inslee came off as more knowledgeable, more passionate, and more powerful on the issue.
Middle ground solutions, like the vice president has proposed, or sort of middling, average-sized things are not going to save us. Too little, too late is too dangerous. Look, these deadlines are set by science. Mr. Vice President, your argument is not with me, it's with science. And unfortunately, your plan is just too late. The science tells us we have to get off coal in 10 years. Yes. Your plan does not do that. We have to have off of fossil fuels in our electrical grid in 15. Your plan simply does not do that. I've heard you say that we need a realistic plan. Here's what I believe.
No, I didn't say that.
Here's what I believe. I believe that survival is realistic, and that's the kind of plan we need.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated and no more subsidies for either one of those, any fossil fuel.
We cannot work this out. The time is up. Our house is on fire. We have to stop using coal in 10 years.
Inslee also attacked Biden over his Iraq vote while simultaneously pointing to his own history of good judgment.
I was only one of 2 members on this panel today who were called to make a judgment about the Iraq War. I was a relatively new member of Congress, and I made the right judgment because it was obvious to me that George Bush was fanning the flames of war.
I find it hard to point to a serious flaw in Inslee's performance, so I've got to count this as a win for him. Biden's response to Inslee's point about Iraq, by the way, was very unfortunate.
I did make a bad judgment trusting the president saying he was only doing this to get inspectors in and get the UN to agree to put inspectors in.
If I hadn't already concluded that this was a bad night for Biden, that answer would have been a pretty good case all on its own. Arguing that you voted for Iraq because you trusted George Bush is not a strong case to make. He's basically saying to Democratic voters, yes, I voted for one of the worst foreign policy blunders in American history, but that was because I had faith in one of the worst presidents in American history.
Fool me once, shame on.
Now, even though I think Biden had a very rough night, I think one of his closest ideological allies, Michael Bennett, performed much better. I consider Bennett to be one of the most forgettable candidates, and least likely to secure the nomination. But he certainly made a few moments throughout the debate. For one thing, he had a standout line in his opening statement.
Last week, I saw one of those Trump signs that says, America, love it or leave it. And it was on the outside of a church.
Hard to forget that. But an even more memorable moment for Bennett came when he was asked this question by Don Lemon.
Senator Bennett, a question for you. Why are you the best candidate to heal the racial divide that exists in this country today, which has been stoked by the president's racist rhetoric?
On the face of it, this seems like a really tough question for Bennett. Unlike many of the other candidates on stage, Bennett's a white guy. He's also one of the most conservative. So I don't know how many people expected his answer to be as strong as it was. Here are some of the highlights.
This is the fourth debate that we have had, and the second time that we have been debating what people did 50 years ago with busing, when our schools are as segregated today as they were 50 years ago. We need a conversation about what's happening now. And we've got a group of K-12 schools that are good because families can spend $1 million, and you've got the Detroit public schools that are as segregated as they were. Equal is not equal. I believe you can draw a straight line from slavery through Jim Crow, through the banking and the redlining to the mass incarceration that we were talking about on this stage a few minutes ago. 88% of the people in our prisons dropped out of high school. Let's fix our school system, and maybe we can fix the prison pipeline that we have.
It's very hard to draw applause from something that begins as a defense of Biden on busing, but he pulled it off before demonstrating genuine knowledge about the intersections of race, education, and incarceration. Look, Bennett has virtually no chance of securing the nomination, and that answer was certainly not enough to make him a serious contender, but that was a very, very strong answer. I gotta give this man a W. Finally, let's talk about Cory Booker. Without a doubt, Booker showed marked improvement in this debate and was a standout candidate. Throughout the night, he demonstrated strength, passion, and knowledge.
We know in this country that our fates are united, that we have a common destiny. The call of this election is the call to unite in common cause and common purpose. Everyone has worth and dignity, and this should be a country that honors for everyone. Nobody should get applause for rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. That is kindergarten. We lost the state of Michigan because everybody from Republicans to Russians were targeting the suppression of African American voters. We need to say that.
Booker also made himself look like a winner by seeming to genuinely enjoy himself on stage. For example, in his banter with Jay Inslee about Greenpeace rankings.
It's one of the reasons why Greenpeace ranks me and him at the top of this entire field of their candidates on climate.
Close. Second, but close. You're just close.
I want to say very clearly, thank you, man. Thank you.
Of course, his performance was not perfect. He fumbled a bit when he was asked about a serious contradiction in his healthcare rhetoric.
You say you support Medicare for all. You also say you are not going to pull private health insurance from more than 150 million Americans in exchange for a government plan. But that's what Medicare for all would do. So how do you square that?
And by the way, credit to CNN, this was a good question too.
Well, first of all, let me just say that the person that's enjoying this debate most right now is Donald Trump as we pit Democrats against each other.
No, Booker, this was a surprisingly serious and legitimate question to be asked on CNN. It concerns policy, not tabloidy personal attacks. You can't just say Trump is laughing when you get caught with an apparent contradiction in your policy proposals. But the CNN moderators weren't the only folks with some serious challenges for Booker. He drew attacks from Biden after criticizing the VP over his support for draconian crime bills.
And Mr. Vice President has said that since the 1970s, every crime bill, major and minor, has had his name on it.
Joe didn't have much to say in response to Booker's critique, but he was prepared to attack Booker on somewhat related issues.
In 2007, you became mayor. You had a police department you went out and you hired Rudy Giuliani's guy. You engaged in stop and frisk. You had 75% of those stops reviewed as illegal. You found yourself in the situation where 3 times as many African-American kids were caught in that chain and caught up. The Justice Department came after you for saying you were engaging in behavior that was inappropriate.
Those are fair and damaging critiques, but Booker managed to deflect them effectively with some witty turns of phrase.
If you want to compare records, and frankly, I'm shocked that you do, I am happy to do that. Mr. Vice President, there's a saying in my community, you're dipping into the Kool-Aid and you don't even know the flavor. You need to come to the city of Newark.
He also backed his idioms with substance.
There are people right now in prison for life for drug offenses because you stood up and used that tough on crime, phony rhetoric that got a lot of people elected, but destroyed communities like mine.
And of course, Booker didn't just stop at criticizing Biden on his tough on crime past. He also got into the fray hitting Biden on immigration issues.
No, Mr. Vice President, we are not going to just let people cross the border. An unlawful crossing is an unlawful crossing if you do it in the civil courts or if you do it through the criminal courts. But the criminal courts is what is giving Donald Trump the ability to truly violate the human rights of people coming to our country.
Booker also knocked Biden with one of the fairest critiques posed to him in this debate. After Biden dodged de Blasio's questions about Obama's deportations, Booker said what I'm sure most people were thinking and hoping to hear.
Mr. Vice President, you can't have it both ways. You invoke President Obama more than anybody in this campaign. You can't do it when it's convenient and then dodge it when it's not.
Okay, so clearly Cory Booker joins the pack of winners for this debate, which also includes Tulsi Gabbard, Jay Inslee, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Michael Bennett. The biggest losers were definitely Joe Biden, and arguably even more so, Kamala Harris. Now, before I wrap things up, I just want to say thank you for watching this video all the way through, and apologize for dropping it so late. Outside of this channel, I also work more than full-time hours, and obviously, these things take a long time to make. Now, one thing that can allow me to dedicate more of my time to making these videos is earning revenue from this channel, so you can help support the work I do here by supporting the channel on Patreon, patreon.com/questiontime. I want to thank all the patrons. I've actually had a bunch of new people sign up in just the last couple of weeks, so shout out to Mike Lodato, Sir Bobbitt, Charlotte Holden, Christopher Green, Nordir, Eduardo Gonzalez, and Blake Mallon. Your support is very much appreciated and needed, especially since my last debate video was monetized by CNN. This one, I'm sure, will also be claimed. Now, technically, everything I do here would probably satisfy just about any legal standard of fair use, but of course, I cannot afford to fight CNN in the courts. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to the candidates or to you in the audience to talk about the debates without showing proper context through clips. So when it comes to earning revenue, at least when it comes to these videos, I guess I'm the answer to the question, who took the L?
Everybody's talking about how terrible I am on these issues. If you agree with me, go to Joe 300, Joe 0330, 1030, Joe 750 billion 10 and help me in this fight. Come on.